Hello, welcome to this session on when we work on computers, how to do so in the most comfortable way. So the ergonomics of how we sit, where we position things, and the effects on our body and some of the ways that we can improve and mitigate against any issues. So we're going to be running through, first of all, the whole process of sitting. Then we're going to focus on our upper body, so our hands, arms, upper body, particularly looking at how to minimise repetitive stress injuries. We're going to look at the screens and the impact on our eyes and some of the things we can do. And last of all, some of the tools that we can use in school to make things a bit better. So we're going to start with the important section of sitting. You would think that sitting down in an office is one of the safest kind of jobs that you can do, but actually sitting itself for a long period of time does have effects on our body. Sitting for more than 6 hours a day can have some disturbing effects. Now 6 hours might seem like a long time, but actually if we are working at a computer, if we drive to work, if we sit in the evenings to eat or to watch telly, 6 hours a day actually is not that long to be stationary in a sitting position. Doing so, though, has real effects. It can increase the risk of heart disease by up to 64%, makes you more at risk for diabetes and certain types of cancer, and particularly for women it has a real impact on bone density. They say about 1% a year. Bone density is maintained by weight-bearing exercises, and obviously if a lot of the time we're sitting, we can have issues here. And if you're like me and have been sitting at a computer, for a couple of decades, obviously that's a lot of bone density. It also has real impact on our posture, from slumping shoulders, so kind of hunching over a screen, peering into things, and has real massive impact on our hip area. So hip flexors are the group of muscles down the front of your leg. There's a whole load of them, as you can see, right from the knee up to the core. And if you can feel for yourself, you're probably sitting right now, when we're in this sat position, our hip flexors, all of these muscles are kind of bunched up, they contract, they're in a very specific layout, and over time they can actually become shortened and very tight. Similarly, the hip extensors are the ones down the back of our leg, and again, for the same reason, just feel for yourself where your muscles are. They're stretched, they're lengthened down the back, and that's not always a good thing. The lengthening can actually cause weakening. So being in this position has a massive effect on these hip flexors and hip extensors. Obviously, none of this is much good. However, the great news is that it's quite easy to overcome these effects, really by doing not very much. And that's what we're going to talk about. The things we're going to talk about is sitting correctly, because that really does have an impact. And then 2 quite simple things. One of them is remembering to stand, and the second one is getting some kind of moderate activity during your day to counteract the long hours of seated behaviour. So let's go through, first of all, sitting correctly. And as we go through this, I would really like you to kind of look and feel for yourself. Don't move yet, but as we look at each section, just see where you are and what you're doing. So here's a nice graphic of the proper sitting position. This would be the ideal. So what can we see here? The first thing is the back. Your back is properly supported. So as you can see, there's a lumbar support, a little lump in the chair, in the small of your back. And so your chair that you're working at should have that level of lumbar support if you're sat at your desk for any amount of time. And you should be able to move this back support up and down so that the lumbar support is in the right place for you. We're all different sizes, so it's not going to be a one-size-fits-all kind of situation. A properly adjusted back support really does counteract the strain on your lower back. So that's important that you have a good chair that does this kind of back support. Secondly, your feet should be able to go flat on the floor. If you're quite short, that might not be the easiest thing, especially if you've had to adjust your chair so that you kind of are in line with the desk. So maybe that you have to have a foot support, a footrest that goes under your desk, but you should be able to have your feet nice and flat on the floor. So check your own back, check that your feet are flat on the floor. I know I'm someone who tends to cross my ankles often, and again that puts stress on my outer hip flexors. The screen is meant to be at eye level, again, so that there's no stress through your neck and shoulders. You might be like me, I use a laptop and therefore I'm not looking directly ahead. You can get lifts for them and whatnot. Or another option, if you can't avoid it, is to try and move your eyes down rather than putting the strain on the back of your neck. But if you can, get the screen at eye level, it's going to be the most useful. And then it's objects like your stapler, your phone, the mouse itself, everything should be easily accessible. You shouldn't have to be twisting or leaning or doing any of those things to access your different objects. And last of all, your shoulders. You need to just be aware of the fact that nearly all of us who sit at a computer slouch forward. We slouch forward when we're looking at our phones, we slouch forward a bit when we're looking at our screens. And so we need to try to pull those shoulders back in order to support the rest of our spine. And a useful thing to do is maybe every now and then, when you think about it, just roll your shoulders back, lift them up one at a time, that sort of thing, and you'll notice how everything falls back into place. So if you haven't already done it, a really good task is to start off by noticing how you're sitting right now. Is there something that you're not great at? Do you do things with your feet, etc.? And try and make a concerted effort to improve that. The very back of your printed notes, there's a little diagram, which is the one that was on the previous slide. That can be quite a useful thing just to print up and have on display to remind yourself. So sitting properly is a really important thing. There's a couple of other really easy things we can do, and one of them is stand up once an hour. Unless you're really sophisticated and have one of these desks that go up and down so you can work standing, most of us don't have that option. However, recent studies, and there's been quite a few of them, have shown that we can alleviate most of those problems I talked about at the start by standing up. Has to be regularly, at least once an hour, and it just allows your body to unkink from the positions we've got into by sitting down. If you're in a group office, it's quite a nice idea that everyone gets and does this sort of thing. So you might want to set an alarm to remind yourself to do it. You might just use the fact that the school bell rings at the end of each period, so that as soon as that bell goes off, that's your indicator that it's time to stand up, have a little wiggle, a little stretch. The suggestion is kind of 1 or 2 minutes, so it's not a huge amount of time, but it's also not just stand up, wiggle your shoulders and sit straight down again. You do need to have a little time, a minute or so, stood up. Some people will set up the alarms app on their computer, so it just goes off. And there are some things that you can add to your computer, things like WorkRave, and they actually dim your desktop. They actually force you not to stay working, and that you can set whatever you like, but actually the screen goes dim for a minute. They drive me nuts because they come at the time I don't particularly want, but it is a thought. And just standing is absolutely fine. Doing a few stretches is even better. We're going to talk about those at the end of this little section. So doing a couple of stretches is ideal. If you want to, stand up now, have a little wiggle, stretch, do your shoulders. move your neck around, just be sure that you're happy, that your body has got a little bit of relief for the moment. The last thing is the suggestion of 30 minutes moderate activity. That might turn your heart to stone and you think, God, not somebody else nagging at me. But again, there is a suggestion that if you do a lot of sitting all day long, that 30 minutes moderate activity is a really important thing to mitigate against some of those things such as heart disease, diabetes and whatnot. Excuse me. Sensible people, I don't need to tell you too much about this, but things such as just a brisk walk would do, walking across the field, walking from one apartment to another, parking a bit further away, anything at all that keeps you moving counts. And of course you don't have to do it all in one go. Break it up into 3 10-minute or 6 5-minute segments, as long as you are moderately active during those times. Quite a nice thing to do is stick it on your phone or get a Fitbit or some sort of pedometer just to see that you're doing a bit of activeness. So let's just finish off this section by looking at a couple of exercises that you can do at work if you find that your kind of lower back, your hips particularly, are a little bit on the inflexible or slightly achy side. The first one is, some people call it a chair stretch or a couch stretch, and you see exactly what it is. You're sticking your foot on your chair, you're keeping the front of your thigh straight and slightly pushing forward your hip joint, and you should feel a stretch through there. So if you're doing a stand-up for a minute, that could be something you'd like to do. The other one is the Grok squat, which we're not great at in the Western world, but the Eastern side of the world tend to do this an awful lot as a comfortable kind of rest position. Very few of us can do this from the start perfectly, because the idea, of course, is that you keep your feet flat. As when we do this, start to lift the heels, and you might only get a few inches down, but it's quite a nice idea to try the Grok squat. Look it up on YouTube if you want a demo of it. But essentially we must keep our heels down, we bend our knees and our bum goes towards the floor, and they do normally suggest that if you're not terribly flexible, hang on to something in order to feel the stretch through. So there are a few ideas for sitting, the problems it causes, and some of the things that we can do to avoid it. Section 2, then we're talking about hands, arms, upper body and repetitive stress injuries.